If we got a second, did I tell you my latest I'm getting older moment?
Yeah,
I was at
yeah,
the
go for it.
I was at the grocery store and I forgot my glasses in the car and I was buying pears and I'm gonna say an honest minute, like it felt like forever, but I'll probably say honestly a minute, like with the pear trying to find because I like to use the self-checkout. So I was trying to like read the code for what it and I'm like I did like as close as I could get. I'm like, no, I was like standing under lights and I was like, I guess I'm gonna go to the checkout. Then right before I left, I'm like, oh yeah, they printed like on the rack. I was like, okay, there's the code. But I was like, I was like, this is the old, like when you're doing this, it's like
Yes.
feel old.
You know what's so funny? Because last night I was staying on campus. I went to the gym for a workout. So I like to wear contacts when I do that, just so my glasses aren't flying around or whatever. And then I went to the grocery store and I had the opposite problem. Like I can see everything, but I couldn't read any labels. And I'm like looking to see if there's like this thing won't come into clarity.
Yeah, just like I could not find a clear spot. I was like, oh, this is
Mm,
Yeah, the problem with the nearsight, the
yeah.
issue of the nearsighted, farsighted thing.
yeah.
Last time I got my eyes checked, the optometrist was like, "Have you thought about bifocals?" I'm like, "Bifocals? What are you
Oh,
talking about?"
I
And
know.
then like a month later, I started realizing, "Oh, I need bifocals." It's yeah, yeah.
uh,
Yes.
we used to be titans of this world. Well, watch us age. Go the way of
Well,
all
I
truth.
suppose we should get underway. And we are recording. I believe it's still recording. Yeah, we're good. And so thank you all for coming today. And these are great opportunities, just as a reminder, to come together and to hear someone offer some reflections on research that they've either done or are currently doing. And it's wonderful to have an interdisciplinary gathering where we
Mhm.
have different questions coming up from all around the table as we pursue richer understanding and practical implications and all those things together. So I'm really excited to have Dr. James Robertson with us today, aka Satan, who brought his bicycle, I'm something like that.
AKA Satan. I'm so glad it's getting recorded.
Yeah. Okay, we'll scratch that. Editor, just take that away. As you know, he teaches in church history at the seminary, and so we're delighted to have this talk. It's going to generate some good discussion, I think. And so I'm going to turn things pretty directly over to you, Jamie. I will say we aim to run about an hour, but the discussion can keep going as long as Jamie's willing to talk. So I do have to leave at 1:15, but I'll keep the room open for whoever wants to keep chatting. Okay. So when I exit at that point, it doesn't mean it's all over. So maybe you can just close things off, Jamie, when you're ready.
Sure, no problem.
All right. Well, thank you and take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm just gonna pull up the very dramatically labeled slide. There we go. Everybody can see that okay, it looks like. So thank you, Dr. Franklin, for inviting me to do this, and thank you for all of you who showed up. This is sort of some of the other work I'm doing, not just on the sort of complex and nuanced realm of Canadian Christian history, but also addressing some concerns about the present day and some arguments that I think are rightfully being made that a lot of Canadian Christians, especially evangelical Christians, seem to be importing issues and concerns from south of the border. And this is nothing new in the short history of this place that we call Canada. So I just want to sort of take us back to a time when Canadian evangelicals saw themselves as not only as superior to their Americans to the south, but also some concerns, hence the very dramatic title of Satan's Bicycle. So, if I may begin by misquoting our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, what was behind this dramatic title, or as I like to say it, get behind me, Schwinn, because this is the time of nation building under the moniker of Canada as a dominion, a purposely biblical term introduced by Leonard Tilley in 1866 after his reading of Psalm 72. The idea Canada should be a God honoring dominion from sea to sea undergirded most evangelical social reforms and national goals at the time. Now, completed over a decade earlier, the railroad assisted in nation building aspirations by uniting and growing numerous evangelical cross country ministries. But these home missions, as they were often referred to, were also plagued by regionalisms, polity issues, and theological differences, which frustrated national and denominational cohesion. This was a time of Protestant superiority in politics, but Catholics remained the largest Christian body. and their control over Quebec granted them political influence that undermined Protestant growth. Darwinism and biblical or higher criticism were well established in numerous universities and by this point relatively well known. But English-speaking evangelicals were facing a myriad of similar challenges all around the globe. As David Bebbington notes, the late 19th century posed a variety of questions to evangelicals about their role in society. So Canadian evangelicals were addressing their role in society in ways that were connected to their co-religionists around the world. And while they weren't overly unique or innovative in the way they presented the faith, the situations they were addressing are unique to Canada. And begin with this. So we have a guy by the name of John Stark, and this is in the Baptist Yearbook. You can see there's the Sunday Cars and Bicycling. This is just the introduction to it. This idea that they are responsible for a growing and concerning amount of Sunday morning absenteeism, as they would call it. And if such be the tendencies that mark the roots of the century, what might we expect at its ripening? As you can see, he times patriotic and religious instinct that calls upon us to show forth heroic efforts to arrest the flow of this awful tide of irreligion. There's another substantial stuff. He's like, if we don't, we may fall victim to the great city, like the great city to the south, by which he's referring to America. And some of the ideas that were lingering within evangelical minds was, of course, the American Civil War, even though it had been decades in the past, was still frequently trotted out as a proof of American debauchery. But also the idea that Canada had, quote unquote, won the race for the West, and places like British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan had been joined into Confederation and were part of the railroad. More on that later. And this sort of gave Canadian evangelicals a sense of pride, but also urgency. And one of the major issues that takes place in Canada that's a little bit different than both America and Britain was the relatively late ascendancy of evangelicals to power. They had, for the first half of the 19th century, for sure, they were popular. They were actually arguably the most popular. And by evangelicals at this point, I'm really talking about Methodists, Congregationalists, Baptists, some of the growing holiness movements, although they didn't have the numbers really at this point. But they were definitely impacting, especially groups like the Methodists. But the first half of the 19th century, it had really been the Anglicans, the Catholics, and the Presbyterians that had been hypercritical of evangelicals. So there had been sort of like a slow growth. Whereas in Britain, there were still lots of Catholics and lots of evangelicals, but they had had a lot more acceptance in Britain. And this was not the experience in Canada. But by the second half of the 19th century, Methodist reformers had made deep inroads into politics. Anglicans no longer held a monopoly over higher education. Quebec had, in fact, joined in Confederation. Baptists were no longer dependent on American missionary agencies, and the clergy reserves had been sold, granting substantial money to various denominations. But of all the evangelical groups, it's likely that the Methodists benefited the most. Writing in 1900, J. Castell Hopkins argued that greater equality between denominations, quote, coupled with the growth of popular democracy and an influx of immigrants made up more of dissenters than of churchmen, rendered the progress of the Methodist denomination during this period the most marked. So by the 1900s, when we're sort of looking at the turn of the century, an industrialized, financially stronger, more united and independent Canada rendered former delineations between evangelicals and churchmen or mainliners mostly obsolete. And this time, influential thinkers like the Presbyterian George Monroe Grant or the Anglican Dyson Haig could blend their respective denominations' historic focus on practical and serious Christianity and their suspicion of overt individualism with a belief in the positive social ramifications of personal or individual faith. Such unions tempered earlier antagonisms as evangelicals and their so-called churchmen found more common ground and ushered in a, quote, more cosmopolitan spirit, embracing a modern tendency toward a pulpit which is able to treat every branch of social life, as well as the theological theory or dogmatic principles. And one of the best examples of this cosmopolitan trend is the Anglican Dyson Haig. Despite belonging to a highly liturgical tradition, Haig frequently stated a familiar evangelical refrain that, quote, personal realization is worth a lifetime of mere formal or hereditary religionism. He was a devoted author, educator, and eventual contributor to The Fundamentals. Haig believed in the historic prestige of his denomination and believed in its unique ability to unite the various factions of Christianity. However, he was also bold enough to note that his denomination, quote, has lost so many simply because her clergy and her people in so many cases have been wanting in common sense, have been wanting in Christian earnestness, and in the love of God, end quote. The realities of Canadian religious history reminded his numerous and various audiences that they must not suppose that it is a correct thing to take it for granted that we are Christ's simply because we repeat the proper creeds or do the right form of worship in church. There must be a definite personal and creative experience. Now, this was not cause to leave the Church of England by any stretch, but to realize the historic wrongs and failures and address them for the sake of Christian unity and Canadian development. His hope to win all dissenters back into the church was to show love not merely by forcing down our theories of the church, but by so living in the life of Christ and preaching Christ as to make her as attractive as a light to groping travelers. Haig is just one example of the measured optimism of this age because he believed in his church's ability to effect real change and ushered in what he labeled as a utopian vision of the Church of England as, quote, the church of the future, the center of unity, and the Protestant Catholic Church of Christ. While obviously not a goal shared by any outside Anglicanism, his desire to dismiss the denominational divisions of previous times in light of this new century were indicative of the age. And now we're going to move on to, we'll get to this quote. It is probable that the most instructive feature of the 3 decades following Confederation has been the tendency toward denominational unity and friendship. A more cosmopolitan spirit has entered into the majority of Canadian churches, and the country as a whole has not remained outside the stream of modern tendency toward a pulpit which is able to treat or which aims at treating of every branch of social life as well as a theological theory or dogmatic principle. Meantime, unity has been in the air. So the important part to recognize about this evangelical ascendancy as we get to this next part is that it came late, and it came right as sort of higher criticism and Darwinism were entering into American and European schools of thought. And so right out of the gate, evangelicals, when they wanted to maintain their place over society, recognized that they had to be very invested in education, which had been at that point against them, and they just didn't have the power to control this. Had been very much within the hands of the Anglicans predominantly, but in certain pockets, the Catholics also had strength over this as well. So the arguments are similar. So I'm going to, this is in my article, so there's a whole section on higher criticism, but I'm just going to stick to the Darwinism because the conclusions are pretty much similar. So I'm just going to, for the sake of time, focus on that. So as we're seeing, those who are opposed to Darwin, so make sure I'm on the right one here. Yeah. Those who are opposed to Darwin believed he negated human dignity by removing people as the pinnacle of creation. Instead of being the image bearers of God, humans were relegated to a level of evolutionary development equal to that of birds, butterflies, or apes. However, in a lecture to fellow ministers, a Methodist by the name of J.G. Lowe argued that Darwin, in providing scientific insights into creation, could help attuned Christians better understand their faith. He encouraged his listeners to remember that, quote, God works in grace as in nature by the slow yet sure laws of evolution, end quote. He found in Darwin's theory a much more worthy concept of the divine that aligned the God of the Bible with the scientific trends of his day. In Darwinism, Lowe saw a patient God at work, working on human sanctification, hence our little model there, over countless generations, rather than, as he put it, a bungling workman, constantly destroying his own constructions and making fresh ones. Now, he was not the only one, and he was not the first one to promote the natural world as a theological teacher. In an 1899 biography of Reverend James Evans, a Methodist by the name of Egerton Young, highlighted how indigenous views on nature impacted Evans' views of nature's creator. While it was interesting and profitable for Evans to desire to connect the Bible to the worldviews of the indigenous peoples of the North, he also was able to see God's presence, quote, in the great book of nature, end quote. The first inhabitants of Canada were not the only non-European sources of wisdom in these debates. Immigration was then, just as it is now, a dominant concern in Canada and with Canadian churches. But Lowe weighed in on this matter of the realm of higher criticism. He argued, quote, the educated Hindu or Persian or Arabian of today could offer insights into translations which has vexed our British and Canadian scholars. So for him, the desire for literalism and much biblical scholarship came from a laudable goal, to provide the most accurate readings of the Bible. However, British worldviews meant that such literalisms achieved the opposite of their intent and distorted original meanings. His solution was to, quote, and forgive the parlance on this, read those Oriental writings as Orientals would read them. Taken in that way, all such passages are full of exquisite meaning and sentiment. but taken in their dry, hard and fast, bald, literal sense, they become absurd, end quote. While immigration was a divisive issue, Lowe's arguments for courting educated immigrants from the ancient Near East to benefit Canadian understanding of the Bible demonstrates just one way in which these academic debates were seen to impact every facet of the Dominion. The Endeavour Herald of 1899 extolled its readers to be likewise flexible in their presentations and understandings of the gospel, because variety is essential to success. Rather than viewing this as a betrayal of historic faith, the anonymous author argued ignoring new philosophies or engaging in predictable worship with familiar sermon themes created a faith in systems and modes of worship rather than in vibrant and engaging Christianity. Repeated and predictable worship practices following these rhythms created, quote, spiritual ruts as deep as graves, and all spirituality is buried within them, end quote. So rather than eschewing Darwinism or higher criticism, Canadian evangelicals could also celebrate these ideas as wonderful progress, which, quote, greatly modifies our conceptions both of God and of his mode of working, end quote. Granted, this is not the view embraced by all evangelicals, and issues around the Bible and science would forever prevent true ideological unity within the large schools of evangelicalism and holiness movements. But even the desire to reconcile the biblical and scientific worldviews seem for evangelicals like Lowe to be incorrect because, quote, reconciling suggests compromise, a patching up of differences, a truce between hostile forces, and so this gives us a false impression. Rather, in the works of Darwin and the various European scholars of literary theory, he saw God equally at work as in the theology of his Christian ancestors. Carefully, he weighed the differences between philosophy and science and theology to arrive at this conclusion. Quote, philosophy, which is the sum and substance of all of these sciences, is the study of God as manifested in his works. Theology is the study of God as manifested in Christ. Now, if both manifestations be of the one God, there can be no hostility. What apparent contradictions there may be are due to our misconceptions. In both, God veils himself as well as reveals. Likewise, George Monroe Grant reiterated the importance of education. Let there be the utmost freedom for scholarship and thought so that Christians could be bold and learned in their faith. None of these scholars were advocating for a simplistic faith devoid of intellectual rigor, but a genuine belief in the power of experiential faith supported by historical Christian doctrine. And again, we're on the heels of the Victorian era. Queen Victoria dies during this time. There's a whole other section on that in this article. But again, the Victorian era really was the first British focus on education of the young. So education is a very dominant theme in this post-Victorian Canadian dialogue. Grant cited advancements in science, archaeology, and literature as spirits of the age, but spirits which had brought much good to the human race. He noted these advancements challenged biblical authority and traditional views of creation and were even, quote, prone to discard the Catholic doctrine of the incarnation, end quote. However, he also reminded evangelical readers that, quote, Christianity has been in touch with life for 19 centuries and will not be laid aside like an outworn garment, end quote. He and others have been examining were counseling leaders to adapt to the growth of the 20th century with its wide horizon in complex civilization. While many would consider certain schools of Baptists or even the later arrival of Pentecostal teachings as greater opponents to these views of the Bible, those are the issues of later decades. In the time period under consideration here, the chief ecclesiastical opponents of progress for Canadian evangelicals were, of course, their Catholic neighbors. Because every great hero story needs a villain. And for the Canadian evangelicals, it was the French Catholics. And I would argue, I want to come back to this, or I want to reiterate this, what I said earlier. The greatest difference between Canadian evangelical growth and that of their co-religionists in the United States or Britain was the impact of Catholicism. While Catholics were numerous south of the border and in Britain, Canadian Protestants remained numerically inferior to Catholics from the time of the British takeover in the 1750s up to and including the present age. Evangelical belief in the importance of thoughtful faith condemned Catholicism as antithetical not only to Christianity, but to Dominion goals. In the words of Robert Choquette, as you can see there, the Dominion of Canada was to become an English-speaking Dominion of the Lord, where Catholics and French Canadians were to be kept in their assigned roles. Excuse me. Evangelical frustrations mounted as Catholics and the French proved remarkably resilient and capable of rejecting such assigned roles. Evangelicals' emphasis on personal faith brought them into conflict over the Catholic Church's hierarchical structure. For numerous evangelicals, they wrote time and again of the Church of Rome placing too much emphasis on structure, sacraments, rituals, and what they labeled gross superstitions, rather than on personal spiritual development, biblical faith, and a direct relationship with God. It also meant that a substantial amount of the Canadian populace remained opposed to the modern trends the Dominion was attempting to embrace. Reporting on the progress of both his denomination and the nation of Canada, we return to Hopkins, who noted, thanks to their attachment to Rome, quote, the habitant is still the cheerful, irresponsible, excitable, moral, and religious peasant of 50 and 100 years ago. Many evangelicals, lost my paper. Many evangelicals were embracing advancement and equipping their people to understand issues like Darwin or immigration or higher criticism. But the Catholic Church's rejections of several of these theological tenets revealed not only their own thinking, but effectively negated individual Canadian Catholics from seeking similar intellectual enlightenment. Such authoritarianism was not merely the bane of ecclesiology, but of the political world as well. Returning to the Endeavour Herald, quote, the collapse of three great Roman Catholic nations, Austria in 1866, France in 1870, and Spain in 1898, proved not only the inefficacy of Catholic governance, but also, quote, augured the dawn of a new era. Never since the days of the Reformation has there been such an open door for Protestant missions, end quote. Despite this missionary potential, the article also exposed the Canadian government's own misguided policies as it pertained to Catholic political influence. So again, another one of the trademarks of the Victorian era was an ecumenism and a desire that all subjects of the crown, quote, be they rich or poor, old or young, male or female, noble or plebeian, Anglican or dissenter, Catholic or Protestant, shall share in the blessings of British civilization. Loyal Canadian evangelicals had a different take on the matter. For them, Catholics were not loyal citizens, but a source of perpetual suspicion and potential violence. As the Dominion sought to expand westward in early post-Confederation days, one of the chief opponents of the national goal was the Métis leader, Louis Riel. While Riel's indigeneity played a significant role in Canada's rejection of his concerns, his Catholicism was also utilized by powerful Protestant Ontario Orange orders and other politicians to justify first dismissing him and then eventually killing him. Presbyterian Alexander Sutherland's retelling of this part of Canadian history is important because he overtly accuses not just Riel, but the Roman Catholic Church of spurring Riel on in hopes of undermining Canada's Western goals. To this end, he writes, it is significant that, as the agitation went on, Riel was in the habit of delivering his inflammable harangues at the church doors on Sundays after the celebration of Mass. It is not too much to say that at any time, a word from the Roman Catholic hierarchy could have stopped the whole agitation, but the word was never uttered. And by ominous silence, the revolt was tacitly, if not openly, encouraged. Thus, from early missionary obstacles to the rejection of intellectual and spiritual freedom to outright sedition, evangelicals blamed Catholics for hindering almost every attempt they were making to advance Christianity and the Dominion of Canada. In praying for Baptist missionaries, John Stark labeled most of the regions he was praying for with geographical designations like the Far West or the Cold North. But when it came to Baptist missions in Quebec, he asked for God to aid the missionaries in dark Quebec. Entering into the 20th century, most evangelicals still viewed the French and the Catholic Quebec as a dark and unenlightened place that posed a threat to Canada due to its sizable population, financial security, and location between Ontario and the Atlantic provinces. If the adage, a society only moves as fast as its slowest member, was true, then the Catholic inhabitants of Canada were the greatest obstacle the Dominion faced as it marched into the modern age of the 20th century. Which will bring us to our final section as we look at materialism and social care. And materialism is a really important development in this. And this takes us back to Stark's comment about Satan's bicycle. By January 1902, illness forced George Monroe Grant to retire from his post as president of Queen's University in Kingston. For Grant, the end of his illustrious career in education, the gravity of his illness, and the dawning of a new century invited reflection about the past and pondering about the future. Grant established the stakes for the young scholars in attendance for his final message to Queen's student body by stating Canada would become, quote, a huge city of pigs, to use Plato's phrase, or a land of high-souled men and women, depending on the teachings and actions of the faithful. While the railway assured the future material success of Canada, he reminded his hearers that a nation is saved by ideas, not material success. Economic success could inflict upon Canadians a less visible but more insidious problem, which, quote, does not show on the streets, end quote, like other vices evangelicals were at that time combating. The true threat to the Canadian people in a time of economic growth was, quote, the vulgar and insolent materialism of thought and life. Because I must state to you plainly, wealth may ruin, but it cannot save a nation, end quote. While he diverged on issues like the temperance movement, he was not a fan of that, Grant is indicative of the evangelical impulse to become involved in a wide-ranging collection of social causes out of spiritual concerns for the health of the Dominion. In the final part of his speech to these students, Grant asked these two rhetorical questions. Which of the two attracts you, my young friends? The power of wealth or the power of ideas? The seen or the unseen? Which are the true foundations and forces of national life? Which will you serve? According to the answer which the mass of Canadian students give, will be the future of Canada, end quote. Previous to these questions, Grant had lambasted the average Canadian for being morally weak, entirely too interested in material advantage. Now, such a vice, while not as clear as alcohol or gambling, revealed the true foundations of the Dominion were crumbling. Such moral weaknesses could render missionary endeavors within Canada impotent to convict because, quote, fanatical Sudanese and Arabs that the Christian faith is, we cannot be convinced that the Christian faith is something beyond their own faith, end quote. Attachment to materialism meant Canadian Christians were not attuned to the spiritual forces beyond their horizon and were betraying the faith for the proverbial 30 pieces of silver. Christians possessing such a carnal view would be unable to speak with any kind of authority to adherents of other religions, many of whom demonstrated greater spiritual depths. In such speeches given by Stark, Grant, and others we've looked at, was an evangelical cosmology which took for granted that the seen world was supported by unseen and more powerful spiritual forces. The connections between the material and spiritual world were the backbone of evangelical thought, theology, missions, and social action. Borrowing an engineering metaphor, the more wealth Canada generated, the greater weight was placed on the invisible spiritual structures that truly upheld the Dominion. Thus, if the spiritual structures were crumbling, as Grant argued they were, Canada would collapse under the weight of its own success into a spiritual degradation, moral vice, irreligion, and the forfeiture of all godliness which underpinned the Dominion. Because each Canadian, quote, is unconsciously molded in his innermost fibers by the life of the state of which he is a member, end quote, such a collapse was more than a national disaster. It would create a series of personal spiritual disasters even the most ardent of believers would be powerless to reverse. Avarice, if left unchecked, would condemn average Canadians to a somewhat predetermined fate. If they lived in a region that did not benefit from the material blessings of the railroad, then they would remain in perpetual poverty. Or, if the opposite were true, they would become too enamored of worldly wealth and lose their souls to the pleasures of this world. Since those in the latter category exerted more political influence, these would be the people who would ensure that Canada became a nation of industrialists, forever tilting future governmental policies in favor of worldly benefits. Methodist William McDonough concurred, indicting the Canadian Railroad as the bane of Sabbath observance. According to McDonough, train shipments were operating 7 days a week in an attempt to continue Canada's upward financial trajectory. Such economic objectives brought increased independence and substantial material benefits, but from a Sabbatarian's perspective, it also brought, quote, all the filth of Sabbath breaking across the entire nation and has wiped out all of our Sabbath law from coast to coast. The spiritual damage this work ethic created far outweighed any material benefits. And according to McDonough, such Sabbath breaking created a nation in which, quote, murders and drunkenness are in full blast, end quote. While McDonough's belief in the train's influence over murder rates is pretty dramatic, and definitely beyond Grant's specific concerns, both were arguing that materialism threatened the God-honoring qualities of the nation. While such evangelical calls to give heed to divine law were not unique to Canada, McDonough and Grant's attention to the railroad is. I'm not going to get into this now, but the Baptists also had another whole section where they talked about the railroad, but they were going up against the Canadian government offering clergy free rail passes to travel and connect their missions coast to coast. And the Baptists went against that, believing that that would give the government too much control over a free church that would then be less capable of speaking critique into the government. So they believe that this was an impingement of worldly blessings onto what the church's role in society was, which is to be a prophetic voice telling the government to change its policies. So to conclude this section, McDonough's Sabbatarianism, Grant's missionary concerns and material concerns, and the Baptist rejection of industrial influence over a free church are just a few examples of the large-scale social movements present in much of the English-speaking evangelical world at this time. While widespread social reforms were a hallmark of this time in Canadian religious history, historian John Webster Grant reminds us that such reforms were, quote, increasingly identified with the kingdom of God, but ultimately any social harmony would have to be buttressed by the solidity of individual character, end quote. The Endeavour continued a discussion about the new century in measured tones and reminded readers that Christianity's role in the public sphere was to focus on piety, not policy. To this end, an editorial appeared in a later version of 1899 that taught the following. We are not fit to lay down the new principles for the organization of society. The time has not come, but we can pray for the time. We can anticipate it so far as light is given each in his own little sphere. And above all things, we must lift up our hearts for that mighty outpouring of the Spirit, in the quickening of saints and in the conversion of sinners, without which it is impossible to take any great step forward in morality. The social care of Canadians struggling with unemployment or addiction provided a chance for the church to grasp a great opportunity, according to George Bryce. And he would go on to say that what the country needs is, quote, ministers who are learning that it is not theirs to hold services, but to serve, end quote. The church could not simply interpret the Bible academically, but had to serve the nation best when it began to, quote, interpret the love of God into social service, end quote. This was also viewed as an antidote to any present or future fears about Canadian irreligion or secularism. Bryce pointedly stated out. There it is. What reason has the Christian church for existing? Many persons are now asking this, before closing up his speech and reiterating his claim that in social service, evangelical Christianity had a definitive answer. The answer is to have a part in that shaping of a better world. So to conclude, and I'll just wrap this up. John Stark asked his fellow Baptist to take seriously the issues of irreligion he saw growing at the dawn of the 20th century. If these root issues were not addressed, what may we expect at their ripening? It is fair to conclude that the evangelical goals for influence, more than the irreligion that vexed so many of them, was the ripened fruit of their labors for a substantial part of the century. Methodists, Presbyterian, and Congregationalists were able to successfully navigate challenges to their respective polities and theologies to form the United Church of Canada in 1925. Despite a significant number of Presbyterians rejecting this union, the United Church would provide care for Canadians during the Great Depression, navigate 2 world wars, and continue to grow, becoming the largest Protestant Canadian denomination in the post-World War II period, almost and in some parts rivaling and superseding Catholic numbers. The attachment to academic and logical defenses of the faith helped fund seminaries and universities across the nation and made it increasingly the religion of the middle class in Canada. The United Church held to its values of practical assistance and remained an outspoken critic of various governmental policies, as well as a champion of various social issues. Due to a variety of issues related to busy schedules in the middle classes, ongoing challenges to the Christian cosmology, divisions over changing sexual ethics in the 1980s, connections to residential schools, the growth of curiosity in other faiths, and aging congregations, the United Church, eventually declined in numbers and influence, but this did not begin to happen until about the 1970s. The loss of its earlier revivalist temperament also opened a space for Pentecostals to become the younger and more vibrant evangelical voice in Canada by the 1980s. French Catholics would remain the perpetual Canadian Christian boogeyman for the entirety of Canadian history up to and including the completion of this sentence. As well, the diversity within Catholicism grew in the late 19th and throughout the 20th centuries as more English-speaking Catholic immigrants arrived, toppling the dominance of French Catholics. This presented numerous obstacles for Catholic leadership. It increased Protestant evangelical anxiety. After the First World War, English-speaking Catholics were able to win some begrudging respect from their Protestant fellow citizens for their involvement in the war and their willingness to denigrate their French co-religionists on some political issues. Despite the United Church and Quebec Catholic leaders teaming up to denounce conscriptions during the last years of the Second World War and some shared positions on social issues like same-sex marriage, these came to pass much later than the time period we are looking at. It was not really until the advent of Vatican II from 1962 to 1965 that Protestants and Catholics could truly begin to embrace a cooperative spirit on the nation stage. However, in present-day Canada, tensions between both the French and the English populations remain, as well as sometimes various places within Protestantism and Catholics, and these remain extant and show little signs of dissipating, even as they've been evolving and changing. The involvement of evangelicals in social care initiatives during the early 1900s reflected an understanding of the Canadian Dominion committed to the material and spiritual concerns of its citizens. These initiatives laid the foundations for the modern social welfare system in Canada, socialized medicine, and the Social Credit Party, and guided Canadians through a period of transition from a rural agrarian society to a more urban industrialized one. Overall, the involvement of evangelicals in social care during the early 1900s was driven by concern that rampant materialism could doom the Dominion, even if evangelicals celebrated the wealth and unity the railroad brought. While the so-called social gospel would be a divisive element within America's evangelical climate, these concerns were muted in the Canadian iterations. Despite strong cross-border connections with American evangelicals, Canadian evangelicals had a strong legacy of social assistance, and subsequent generations found it easier to unite their faith with active social care. Ultimately, the evangelicals examined here were very successful in advancing their influence over Canada in the early days of the 20th century. It is true they were never able to fully combat Canadian regionalisms, but various home mission endeavors were instrumental in creating unifying patterns of thought and belief that brought a semblance of national religious cohesion. While the United Church did provide some advancements in this regard, the dominance of Catholics, the vast geography of Canada, and the relatively small population proved too daunting for the lasting cohesion many evangelicals in the early 1900s were trying to build. It could be argued that Stark's concern about irreligion proved accurate, but most of these matured slowly and became the issues of much later generations of Canadian evangelicals. While many today label Canada a post-Christendom land, the evangelicals we've been looking at were instrumental in laying solid foundations for Christianity to carry on for decades after their departure. They displayed Herculean efforts to show the relevance of the evangelical message for Canadians, and their notions of the Canadian Dominion only began to dissipate in the later 1960s. This is truly an impressive feat. While American evangelicals have been able to maintain a vast geographical, socio-political Christian culture known popularly as the Bible Belt, Canadian evangelicals were unable to duplicate such longevity. However, there remains within even post-Christendom Canada strong pockets of dominant evangelical culture in places like Three Hills, Alberta, Fraser Valley, British Columbia, and Carleton County, New Brunswick. So rather than focusing on a Canadian evangelical's inability to construct a Bible Belt, perhaps the best way to understand their legacy is the ongoing presence of these Canadian Bible buttons. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Jamie. That was very interesting. And oh man, I've got so many thoughts flowing through my head, so many potential questions. But I'll refrain. I'm going to invite others. We can engage in some discussion around the paper. Maybe I could just make a comment to start off. Again, there's so many threads. One of them, just because I'm involved in the faith science discussions,
Yeah.
was just interesting to hear about some of these Canadian evangelicals and the response to Darwinism.
Yeah.
There's a really good book about, I think it's David Livingston, about how evangelicals in Britain responded to Darwinism, largely positively and sometimes negatively. And, you hear about famous scientists like, I don't know, Descartes and Bacon and people with Christian faith. But you don't hear a lot about Canadians.
Yeah.
So that was just kind of neat to hear. I don't hear about Canadians in many of those circles and in our history. So yeah, I was thankful for that.
Yeah, and it's like Phyllis Earhart's done some great work, as well as other sort of historians of Canadian religion say like it was a very nuanced response. And as the time went by, and again, like we look at Toronto especially, like Victoria, like a lot of like what we become United Church universities, were a lot more versed in this. It made and ruined certain careers for sure. Like I don't want to give the idea that it was a homogenous, but I would say probably as with a lot of Canadian things, the vast majority of people were somewhat not indifferent, but moderate. And then it actually in some sort of like early Methodists, like doesn't matter. I don't have to go through that. It kind of almost became cohesive with this idea of progress. So it almost became trendy, and it's like, yeah, if your thoughts were to balance it out with a sort of like, you know what, I see an evolution, just an understanding of how God works, not a challenge of the way God works. It almost became a very it kind of coincided with this again, the sort of push towards Canada as this very progressive modern nation. Even though they would use the word modern, I don't think they'd use the word progressive. They would use the word progress. So it kind of, in a large amount of evangelicals, it did actually become somewhat tied to nationalistic goals. And then, of course, there's those who are dead set opposed to it. And then again, like on the spectrum I'm all aware of, there are those who lost their careers, and a couple cases, rightfully so, for just kind of throwing out the Bible in favor of the tenets of the day. But as usual, I'd say that side was pretty small. The really opposed to it would be a little bit larger, but then a good chunk of advocates were sort of that more moderate, even if they didn't speak as much as, for example, those who are outspoken against it. And then just to wrap that up, Dyson Haig does the Anglican I talked about. So by 1910 to 1912, we have the fundamentals coming out. And that's largely considered to be Baptist. But of course, it's evangelicals all around the world, including a couple Canadians like Dyson Haig. And they take some pretty hard stances against this. Like it does become, like evolution becomes one of the major, evolution and higher criticism are arguably the two sort of inciting factors to actually creating these fundamental beliefs. And again, that's going to sort of help with the Baptists and the Presbyterians form camps that you're kind of where you're less able to be a moderate. But I would make the argument the especially the Anglicans and Presbyterians in the first half of the 19th century, same sort of thing. Like you would have Anglicans that if somebody was trying to get rid of them, they'd accuse them of being enthusiastics, which meant they were too close to sort of evangelical, which when I say evangelical here, American sensibility. So there was this kind of sense like we got to kind of distance ourselves from this camp to save our own career. So yeah, glad that sort of, and you're right, we don't hear a lot about Canadians on this.
No, no, very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. It was really interesting, and I've done I'm more familiar with the British context, but there's a lot of parallels.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like the word evangelical had a different and broader meaning at that time, and you had people who you could call liberal evangelicals, basically, which today sounds like an oxymoron, but in that time was not. There were lots of people who were basically they're liberal Protestants theologically, but they're evangelicals. They speak the language of evangelicalism, but their evangelicalism is more. It's not about as much of it's more about piety. It's more about a spirituality.
Yes.
A kind of revivalistic, conversionist kind of emphasis on this is I hear this is seems like what's uniting these evangelicals. It's more that emphasis on getting people truly converted.
Yes.
But then yes, in the 20th century, after fundamentalism, modernism, evangelical becomes more associated with theological conservatism.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And certainly that's the US, right? And then, but it probably, like you're saying with a lot of these things in Canada, yes, just maybe less so.
Yeah.
It just seems like Canadians are just kind of meh. Like we just, we're never as committed or as into whatever it is. Like we're just, okay. Yeah. We're polarized, but not as polarized.
Yeah.
But,
and I mean, I think so there's been some interesting sort of digressions within historical stuff. So there, like in 1986, this guy named Ramsey Cook released a pretty important work called The Regenerators. And his big critique was that from Victorian era up to about this time period that we're talking about, so we'll say to like about 1910, evangelicals, and again, you're right, there's a very broad sort of term. It's a condemnatory term in the first half of the 19th century. And then again, we have to consider social ramifications because they sell off the clergy reserves, which is a seventh of the land, and there's a ton of money behind it. And basically the government says, okay, Anglicans get this amount, Presbyterians get this amount, Catholics get this amount because we have to honor, Battle Plains of Abraham. And then they put the designation Methodist. Now, there's so many different types. It becomes a sort of internal battle to be like, oh, because there's a substantial fiduciary incentive. Mm-hmm. So that evangelical thing kind of goes through like a social sort of shifting mid-century. Mm-hmm. But what Ramsey Cook's going to say in the Victorian era and into the early 20th centuries is that basically evangelicals, and he's not super counting the holiness, he's talking about more like this mainstream, which at that point would be like the Methodist, the Congregationalists, although they're very small, the ones who are going to form the United Church, are inadvertently creating their own death by getting involved in the social mm-hmm. Like they basically put themselves into that. They created their own liberal Protestant camp, as you would say, before the fundamentals even came out. So it was a lot of people sort of argued against that. I'm not overly convinced by this thing because again, there's sort of this like sort of two-prong approach is we want people to be converted, but we understand that if they can't eat or they can't feed their family, then they're not going to listen to the gospel. So it was a bit more of a nuanced two-prong approach. It's like, we got to make sure that everybody's being taken care of physically so that they have the ability to appreciate the eternity. Because if you can't feed your family, you don't have time to think about eternity. And so there was that kind of, and that was sort of that's the Satan's bicycle, which I just, as soon as I read that, I was like, that's going to be a topic title for sure. That was more a critique of what we would now refer to as the middle class. These are people who have, and it's not just bikes, it's also cars. He's like, now we have these people spending Sunday, the Sabbath day, going for bike rides instead of going to church. But that's not a concern of the ones who need social assistance because they can't afford a bike or a car, obviously. So it is that kind of you're right. It's absolutely piety driven and conversion driven, but with, in a way, very superior to America with a real focus, money, and a balanced approach to social issues as well. And that's why we have, like, we talk about this so much, but it's true. Like, this is why Tommy Douglas is like, because I'm a Baptist, I want socialized healthcare. Like, people can't talk about Jesus if they're dying of measles or smallpox, and we've got money, we can do it. Remember when Canada had money? Good days.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I have so many more things to say, but I have to go to another meeting, but thank you. We'll talk later.
Yeah. And thanks for your question. See you, man.
So in the U.S., you mentioned that there's this division, the social gospel movement, and then there's a time I'm guessing wrapped up with maybe Vietnam and everything and McCarthyism, and so anything social is now communist. But
yeah,
that notion doesn't seem part of Canadian evangelicalism. Maybe it seeps into it today. I don't know. To what extent does it? And what accounts for, any idea what accounts for that difference? Like why hasn't the Canadian gut reaction been, oh, that's communism, every time we hear, feed the poor or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is what James Pedler brought up too. The sort of great tension of Canada is to Europe we look American, and to America we look European, and we don't really have a sense of who we are from top to bottom either. But these are definitely competing influences. And then a lot of my work sort of shows like the sort of groundwork of the indigenous influences over French culture of English culture, et cetera, et cetera. So we do have some interesting sort of dynamics. Now, as it pertains specifically to Christianity, I think one of the major points I always try to bring up to students and through some of my other work is we often forget that Canada is, by virtue of population, a Catholic country with Protestant governance. And so Catholicism does have, for all you can critique and stuff like that, there is a social hierarchical sort of structure in there that actually does fit quite well within the British structure. So we are definitely a more structured people than America. And that seems on surface to be a bit of a stereotype, but revivalism, evangelicalism fit perfectly in the American narrative, especially Manifest Destiny and the incredible adventures of the West, which we know the dark side of, but really are just tales of unbelievable hardships and bravery and throwing yourself into the unknown with no promise other than, we'll get some sort of land, but all sorts of dangers, real and imagined, and all these other things, where and without a very dominant Catholic. Like, they really, after the American Revolution, like even the Church of England, a hierarchical structure is very problematic. Like, remember, America doesn't get their first presidential, they don't get their first Catholic president until Kennedy. So it's a long time coming. So Catholics do not have anywhere near the influence that they do in Canada, which, and I don't mean this in a negative way, definitely puts a ceiling on the influence of revivalism. And then the Anglicans go on that. So we have two very hierarchical structures who believe in their core that the strength of their hierarchy is that they can offer social assistance. So this is always the Anglican thing. Is like, we've got more money, we've got more Bibles, we've got more church structures. Church structures could shelter people, they could become town centers. So I think that did temper Canadian, even evangelical responses. Because again, we got the Methodists, who are considered basically the worst kind of American religion. They will, by about the 1850s, trade in all their revivalism for money, and I'm not dumping on them, but it is that sort of order and structure. They get churches, they get respectability, they get, actually, through Edgerton Ryerson, I know, scandal noted, they can see it, Hugh. They can influence Canadian policy in ways that they saw as very problematic earlier on, because the Anglicans, the Presbyterians, and the Catholics were grotesquely favored. And there was a real imbalance. And so anybody with a personal sort of faith almost had nowhere to go, and they considered it religious tyranny. So they had to sort of blend these two things together. And you do get a very socially responsible, and it becomes respectable faith. Respectable faith kind of becomes the way in which you can operate well in Canada, and definitely to the 20th century, as we switch from the sort of agrarian to a much more industrialized nation. Good question. Thank you.
Jamie,
Hey, Gord.
hey, I'm curious, how did some of those shifts that you're talking about present themselves in terms of political structures, political affiliation, and things like that? Did
Oh,
they was that did evangelicals kind of gravitate to one particular political position or party, or
oh.
was it kind of spread across the board?
Yeah, good question. This is going to be an inadequate answer, because depending on when we're talking about, there's a lot, there's no, yeah, definitely not like nowadays where you'd sort of look at like evangelicals, for lack of a better term, are going to be Republican and conservative. It definitely, it flip-flops back and forth. And there is some dialogue. I'd actually be very curious to sort of look at like some of the data, how influential such dialogue was about various political parties. But again, England sort of was switching back from the Tories to the Whigs and Labor, and it kind of, there was enough of a bit bopping through, depending on what sort of like other things were happening, that Canada kind of duplicated that as well. So you don't have sort of like an allegiance to a particular political party, but nor do you have an allegiance necessarily to a different ideology. It was more in response. So like, this is where Tommy Douglas gets so popular, is like his idea of socialized healthcare and socialized medicine, and just a more socialized thing, really responds to concerns over the crash of the economy, the depression. Because there's also William Aberhart, another Baptist who doesn't get as much credit, but he starts the Social Credit Party. And so these are very much in responses to real world things. So there does seem to be the party that can respond in the great Canadian maxim of maximum willingness to help, minimum how do I so maximum willing to provide help, minimum amount of like attaching strings to that. So again, this is where the United Church does really well, and it's only 5 years old when the depression hits, right? Like, it's really young, but they start opening up. Pastors take pay cuts. They start opening up churches as food banks and shelters. They're around there, and that wins them a lot of allegiance from people, because like, we'll come in and listen to your talks about the faith because you're running a soup kitchen, because you're giving us opportunities to find jobs and stuff like that. So there does sort of seem to be this almost like a pragmatic um, adherence to political parties that are able to cleverly and socially address whatever crises is happening. And then when things are good, things seem pretty moderate. It really is going to be that, honestly, Canada's Kennedy. Like, it's going to be Trudeau, who sort of had that whatever your thoughts are on Trudeau Senior, he had that sort of genius understanding. Is like, for the most part, you're going to have your far left and you're going to have your far right, and that'll be like 20 to 30%. He's like, the vast majority of Canadians, as long as there's no crises, you can keep, taxes relatively low and the economy relatively stable. They're going to go middle of the road. And so that's when he's like, all right, I'm going to push the Conservatives right, NDP left, and the Liberals will always be middle of the road. And then we can almost guarantee that most elections on a federal level anyway are ours to lose. And he was right. And that does tend to be, and George Rollick did great work on this. He's like, the big story of Canadian politics is that we're not super political. We don't have the theater. Now, again, we can disagree with this. He's like, but the sort of the origins of Canadian politics was pretty basic. Taxes low, land is free, give us a good ability to live, and anybody that can respond to what's perceived as a crisis will get the votes. And the churches will swing back and forth as well. And so that's why you can have a lot of, which is ironic that given the Federalist American sort of like separation of church and state, Canada, without ever sort of articulating that, has lived that out. Like, most people wouldn't have no idea what Christian, like most people thought Trudeau, again, back to him, was, if anything, he was communist, to Patrick's point, but he was a devout Catholic. He disagreed with a whole bunch of his own policies, but he's like, but it's not really, that's his whole line. Like, the state has no business in the bedroom of the nations. He's like, I personally disagree with divorce, abortion, but he's like, but I got to do that as a Catholic, not as a prime minister. Whereas in America, heaven help you if you're not some form of Christianity. So there's always seemed to be a nice sort of delineation between what the church's role is and what the state's role is. And then, just to sort of wrap this up, that's when I go back to that really interesting section. We just didn't have time. Of the Baptists saying, this is really nice. It would save us money. And it would actually, and the Baptists weren't rich at this time. It's like, could actually help us grow stuff. But our job is to critique the government on a national level. And if they're paying for us to do that, we're either going to, it's going to look hypocritical, or we're going to be reticent to do that for fear of losing it. So no, if we want a free church in a free state, the church has to be there to critique the state. Granted, they're Baptists, and that's kind of their origin story. Baptists is critiquing religious structures. So there really isn't that sort of like, if you're this kind of Christian, you're going to vote this kind of way. Not at all. Or it could shift depending on what's happening.
So many questions, Jamie. So many questions.
Such a good question. That's good. And that actually deserves a little bit more work, but that's my early understanding of it.
No, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't want to dominate the questions or discussion. So anybody else, I could throw another one out there though. And it's so interesting because, you have this rich history, and you've got, the sort of libertines down in the States, and they're all after life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we're up here with peace, order, and good government.
Yeah, that's it.
But yeah, and even the way that was it Rawlink who you said who the big story about politics, that we're not very political. But then comes the television and radio and the internet and social media. And so now, like, I wonder if a lot of the ways that we're behaving now seem to be more American in some ways, and maybe that's like, do you think that that's a big part of that, or what's the story there?
Oh yeah, because we've imported, like, we're a little bit behind the glass, so we're still looking like, I mean, what's a good way to put it? We still are aware that this is American TV. Like, as close as we are, it's like all the cultural things are overlap. There is still that little half step. Okay, see you, Gord. So that's always interesting. So we got just enough of a disconnection where we're kind of still outside observers, but of course its impact over us is manifest. And it is interesting to sort of look at it. Dr. Chapman could talk to this as well, like, very powerfully. Sorry, Mark, didn't mean to put you on the spot there, but again, what we're seeing just with the advent of technology is those regionalisms that were so important in all the time periods we've been talking about. Those have largely disbanded. So things like Three Hills or Carleton County, they're less the Bible buttons than they used to be. So I think it's Brian Clark and Stu McDonald's, like, Leaving Christianity, or like, there is no region in Canada where a church could, count on a large portion of the population attending. So that's like a major thing is we don't have that Bible Belt right down the middle. There's nothing like that in Canada. Even the Bible buttons are starting to shrink a little bit. So I don't think it's just the media going north south. It's also the connections going east and west, where the dominant sort of voice is more towards, I hate these terms, but secularization. So even these sort of like formerly dominant evangelical strongholds are much more given over to the overarching dominant culture of Canada. And basically it's an intentional move. It takes place in 1967. Like we can point to the day, it's July 1st, when the government sort of rolls out in a ceremony that begins with a call to worship, has all religious leaders on there. It begins with a worship service, and its message is he's like, religion is great. And we want a religion that, again, back to the social thing, highlights love of neighbor, care for one another, self-sacrificial care, and the exclusionary elements. Jesus is the only way to heaven. You have to follow Muhammad. All these different, the prophet, blessed be his name. All these different sort of things. Great, fill your boots. But when you walk out the house or out the church, take that part of your faith that will help your neighbor, irrespective of creed, confession, whatnot, and go forward. That way, everybody kind of gets advancement. And up until that point, the people we were looking at in this presentation really were the dominant policymakers of Canada. So it was very Christian. But I think the point we're making is like, as much as it was very Protestant, like a very Protestant Christendom, there's a lot more space for what I would think would be actually really kind of enlightened sense of responsibility to all people. We don't like the Catholics, but we're going to honor what happened in the 1700s. We don't like the English speaking Catholics, but they're willing to dump on the French because it boils down to the English and the French, always has. And because they've got these hospitals and because they're willing to hire non-Catholics and non-Catholics are allowed in their education system that we're paying for, there's a lot more room to move and just kind of get along. And then the last sort of piece of it is it is cold here. And I have wonderful stories. I've always wanted to sort of put these together. Wonderful stories of, for example, Baptist and Methodist missionaries to the West in like the late 1800s, late 19th century, almost freezing to death. But the Catholics who've been out there for 2 centuries, who had these big, beautiful churches, brought them in and saved their lives. Never agreeing with each other on theology, sort of looking at each other very much as rivals, but it's like, but not enough where I can let you freeze to death on my doorstep. So these are another sort of portion that's sort of like, we do kind of have to get along or else everybody's going to go down. So I hope that kind of gets to it. But you're right about the media, and it really does boil down to televangelism. Radio ministries in that World War II, Second World War period, and then the advent of Bible colleges in the prairies, in response largely to Darwinism and higher criticism and the idea that all the universities in the cities have gone too liberal. So we're going to go out to there, but also being very poor because it is the dirty 30s. So they lean very heavily on radio ministries from people like C.I. Scofield and coming up from the States. And so that shapes a lot of the sort of like conservative Protestant, apocalyptic sort of stuff, which again is really interesting because you got Bible Bill Eberhard, who's a hardcore fundamentalist, but still gets into a lot of trouble with his own people because rather than seeing it as polishing brass on the Titanic, he says, no, he still forms the Social Credit Party. It's like, no, we still got to take care of stuff here, even though the other fundamentalists like, no, the dirty 30s was a result of God's punishment on liberal Canada. So there's always these kind of weird complexities and nuances that the media ruined. Thanks a lot, Jim and Tammy Faye.
Hi, Jamie.
Hey, John.
Yes, thank you so much for that presentation. I always love a
Thank
good
you for your massive library.
Yeah, I know. Well, they're invisible books. Yeah. Spiritual in that sense. But yeah, I just always, one of the things I find interesting in church history is,
Bye, Candace.
At different stages of history, at different times, there's always some other there's always some issue that Christians get so anxious about. And it kind of takes center stage, center of debate, even for the church. Understandably, it's a central issue in society, but it takes center stage in the church. What you mentioned, I think, was evolution and higher criticism. And I also enjoyed the references to someone spazzing out about cars and trains and bicycles.
Yeah. So good. Satan's bicycle.
Yeah, that's right. It's unbelievable, right? And, I know you're kind of doing this as maybe a lesson for us today. And even today, we take various issues in society and bring them to the center and
Mm.
make them a real focal point for Christianity. And nowadays we might look at some of these issues like higher criticism or evolution and think, not a huge deal. There are different views on it, and we can kind of live with it. And but at the time, the church reacts with such anxiety to
Mhm.
these threats, let's say, and the whole world is going to come falling down.
Government stuff. I don't know what's happening. So that becomes a big the issues can change. You're right, like the details can change, but the anxieties and whatnot can remain the same. So like the short answer is just as a historian, it does give me a sort of a sense of calm and peace that we've always been here before. And honestly, things are objectively have never been better. Objectively, never better. Our quality of life, our access to entertainment, to basic healthcare, to all that sort of stuff. We know that. We live better than emperors and kings and any other time in human history. Subjectively, different story. So the anxieties are one, theologically, I still hold to this powerful, imaginative vision of the kingdom of God that I find in Revelation. Not the ways I was taught to interpret Revelation, but just in the sort of overarching structure of John is on Patmos. He gets the curtain of time and space revealed, and everybody's already celebrating and falling down to the throne room of God. And he's like, oh, okay. So it's already done. And then however long the story goes on in our construct of time, it's kind of irrelevant. So we all kind of live that out. So that always sort of undergirds me in times of anxiety. Two, it has always been worse, and we're never going to come across something that Christians in the past haven't sort of spoken to with some sort of lucidity, and also given us cautionary tales as well. And I would say that these stories of these Christians in Canada again sort of show that we're never not going to. I don't think any of us feel like it's okay to remove ourselves from the issues of society. I mean, that is the incarnation. We have this sort of understanding deep in our bones and deep in our souls that the incarnation says that this life, this world, these issues actually do matter to God. Therefore, they matter to me. How we respond to them would be great to have a little bit more calm and a little bit more willingness to sit back and find that, it's trendy, but like that sort of third way, that Jesus way is like, okay, so here's one way to look at it. And there's a whole bunch of people in this. Here's another way to look at it. And there's a whole bunch, and then there's a sort of fight. But Jesus always found that other way to expose the what was kind of comical about the other two sides, or what was hypocritical, or whatever. So I do think we've still got the science, and obviously Patrick Franklin can speak to this. I do think we got that science versus faith debates happening now, and so we sort of look at somebody like Lowe or Grant or others that are like, okay, what is this actually telling us, and why? Let's not be so reactionary. Let's actually kind of come up this with an intellectual understanding. So my long and short answer is probably get to talking with people from different perspectives, really sort of start to look back at history, like some of the different times when we've had similar sort of instances like this, and then really see Mark, and then really look to our own country, like look to Canada where we are, whether you're from here or not, look to this place because it does actually have some unique places and probably worked into its DNA a little bit more language and spaces to find that more moderate third way response. Because we don't have that too political system, we do tend to have a few more different like areas from which to operate. But
Yeah.
we'll never get control. I think that's probably the biggest thing is there's never been in the history of Canada, other than this sort of time period, as things have progressed. And I think to Patrick's point earlier about media, sorry, I want to close with this, is there is no, like even in the 80s when it was around same-sex marriage, or again in the 21st century, something like that, we've never had, I think it's really important to recognize, Canada doesn't create Christian celebrities. That's really weird because we should. I mean, we've got like all the similar culture, like America, just, you can swing a cat and not hit you can't swing a cat without hitting a Christian celebrity. Canada has nothing on that level. And any kind of couple that have been sort of big have gone to the States. to get big. So we do have like Amy Semple McPherson, and actually, when you look at who I'm talking about, all of them are pretty scandalous. So you're like, yeah, right. There might be something kind of good about not having Canadian Christian celebrities. Does that get to that at all?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I love your reference to Revelation and knowing
Yeah.
the final outcome from the beginning.
Yeah.
And I was just gonna say, like,
Hi, Rebecca.
yeah, all these issues, Christians react to them like there's some sort of torpedo that's going to sink the whole Christian faith.
Yeah.
But it would also be good to think about like what has remained the same throughout the ages.
Yeah.
Christians have, sort of rallied around, regardless of the cultural changes and on this and that issue. So what do we
Yeah.
actually hold on to? What is home base for us? So
Yeah.
we don't need to worry so much about, oh, there's a new thing. Okay, well, we'll figure it out, but
Yeah.
we're not gonna freak out about it.
I like you sort of sit back, you're like, okay, we will like I think that's all of anxiety, right? Is just sort of like projecting yourself into an like a future you don't want. So even just be able to sit back and like, okay, I don't know right now, but we will figure it out. Gives you sort of that sort of sense of calm. For me, what's helped me sort of practically is like, all right, crisis. What are my first instincts? What are my first sort of sentences? What are my first sort of things? And then I take that and be like, now how are those indicative of the camps I was raised in? And that's always sort of my bigger point. I was like, if you could just see Mrs. Conservative Christian about purity culture and whatever, and Mr. Liberal Christianity about like no, none of this matters. It's just the mystical Christ. And be like, these aren't. They feel good to you, but these are not universal truth claims. These are actually indicative of the camp you're in. And I'll be honest, if you're too much into one camp, I had my doctor supervisor, Dr. Heath, he actually put this beautifully for me. It's kind of walked with me the whole way. He's like, it's uh, uh, F. Scott Fitzgerald's definition of intelligence is the ability to hold seemingly diametrically opposed opinions at the same time and walk forward. He's like, that's real intelligence. When you can take two sort of tensions, hold them both, and walk forward. And his understanding or his sort of explanation of that is like, throughout history, we're always kind of balancing Jesus is human, Jesus is divine. We are saint, we are sinner. God is one, God is Trinity. All these different sort of diametrical oppositions going back to Lowe's sort of understanding of like philosophy and Christianity are not enemies. They're both from the same God, and anything that we see as as like opposing is our own. And I love that he's like that's actually us not understanding it yet because God both reveals Himself and conceals Himself in both. So maybe we just have the breath to be like, okay, these are coming at it from the same way. We just haven't quite figured out how to unite these two. And Dr. Heath's point was like, anytime you sort of focus on one, like Jesus' humanity, you start to lose the divinity, you're in trouble. Anytime you start to look at Jesus' divinity and start to let go of the humanity, you're also in trouble. He's like, it's this kind of shifting bounce back and forth. And that's those sort of tensions, I think, actually give us some good pause and some light faith. But my next sort of step is like, okay, how am I just speaking out of the camp I was raised in? How am I just sort of being my father's son right now? And for good and for bad. And because everybody sort of got these preconceived notions that if you don't take the time to sort of look at, you're just going to do some sort of variation of that and not actually ever really get to the root problem. So that's another big piece for me is like, okay, how am I being a good Canadian Baptist right now with all my sort of ideas about this sort of stuff? I'm like, okay, that's good. But also where has my denomination maybe or this worldview been inadequate in the past? Or could another worldview actually speak beneficially into it?
Yeah.
For example, intercultural stuff, working with the indigenous is like there are other perspectives here that I can weigh in and get into good. So like my relationship with you, John, as it's burgeoning and stuff like that, I'm going to learn a lot from you because of your character as well as your intellect. And I think that's a good space to sort of personally, microly do it.
Yeah. Thank you, Jamie.
Thanks, John. Appreciate you coming out.
Yeah.
I know Patrick's got to go. Russell and Ken, I might just sort of shut down the recording unless there's any sort of last minute stuff. But we're 15 minutes over, and I appreciate everybody coming. All right. Anything else, John?
No, except for see you next time, my friend.
All right, my friend. Take care.
All right, have a good one.
All right, Ken, John. Patrick, I don't know if you're there, but I'm just going to shut it down.